Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts as they share with you the insider's guide to property investing.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch, your insider's guide to property investing. I'm Bryce Holdaway. He's Ben Kingsley. How are you, Ben?
Good, mate. You?
Not too bad, thanks. It's good to know that this week it's not the recovery couch. It's actually legitimately the Property Couch. Which
Up
is
and about.
Up and about.
Up and about.
Hey, we started this podcast. It was an idea that we had floated.
Well, let's face it, you had the idea, mate. It wasn't my idea. You came to me and said, I want to do a podcast on property investment. I said, sure.
And who did I want to partner with? The Property Investment Advisor of the Year. So I think it was a pretty good strategic move by me. And the idea was to give people, our tagline is the insider's guide to property investing. So this week, we've actually got a question from one of our listeners who I think has hit the pocket in terms of a question that they ask, because it's going to draw on a lot of the podcasts that we've done up until this point.
Yep. And
it's going to bring it all together. And it's kind of, instead of being a Q&A, it's more of a real life investing scenario that we want to chat about today. And I think there's lots to discuss. So happy to go with that.
Oh, look, as soon as I saw this question come through from Aaron, I just thought this must be a podcast.
It must be a podcast. It's a really, really good question, because it's kind of someone who's been on the ground trying to use the information that we're talking about and has hit a roadblock.
And can still make a big mistake, even if they're in one of the areas, my 80-20 principle. Area delivers 80% of return, property delivers 20%. Well, if you pick an asset like this, it doesn't ring true.
Agreed. So he's given us a very, very lengthy question here. And so I'm going to cover it off in chunks, but there's some principles here. And ultimately the overriding principle of this question that Aaron has, and thank you, Aaron, for your question. And to be honest, we're getting some really great feedback, Ben, on the website about the podcast. And we're also getting some really great questions. So we will cover all of those questions in future podcasts. But effectively what Aaron is saying is, I followed your principle of your 80-20, where location delivers most of the heavy lifting, but I've arrived at a situation where I think I've got the location right, the property hasn't delivered. And so let's see if we can. I've been listening to your podcast and really love every single episode. I've got a question. Why some apartments that seem to tick all the boxes just don't appreciate in price over time? Now, he goes on to give an example of a development in Brunswick in Melbourne. So those people who don't live in Melbourne, it's a very inner city suburb, close to the Melbourne CBD, and got lots going for it. It's what we would consider to be an investment grade suburb. And so his question is, location, it seems excellent, south end of Brunswick, it's 4.8 k's from the CBD, very close to the city, but so much high-rise apartments in its neighbourhood to complete. And that's actually part of the answer to the question. We all know the warning about staying away from Melbourne CBD apartments, and that's true. Train station and tram line are only 500 metres away. Walk an extra 100 metres and you'd reach a decent shopping centre, Berkeley Square, a second tram line, and another supermarket of 300 metres to its west. It's also in the catchment of Brunswick Southwest Primary School and Brunswick Secondary College. Both are the best public schools in Victoria. Library, theatre, swimming pool and shops are all within 10 minutes walk. There is no chemical factory or waste dump or other facility that can dampen the price. All sounds pretty good so far.
It does. Ticking a lot of boxes.
Now, property-wise, this address contains approximately, here we have it, 130 apartments, 1 to 3 bedroom units, all in decent size, simple but modern decoration. Unlike newer but tiny apartments, this one has Owner-Occupier Appeal. The apartment started off the plan in 2007, but the building was completed in 2010. When I looked at the sales history of this address, I found all units sold in the address have only achieved little, if no price gain at all since 2010. And he's gone on to show 2 examples within the development. We're not going to name the street or the address, but it's in Brunswick. And then he's gone on to say after that, in contrast, all other apartments sold in Brunswick between 2014-15, let's say 30 years old, were sold at a much higher price, despite that they are smaller in size, 1 or 2 train stops further away from the city, or warehouse converted. So, Ben, this is really a very, very good case study about a few principles, but I'm sure you're itching to jump in and share something.
Well, I know there's a lot to talk about here. Look, the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that when a developer pushes for its development to be built, usually they're trying to maximise their returns. By maximising those returns, they're looking to get as many apartments in the complex as they possibly can, because obviously with every different apartment they're selling, that's where they make their money. So the margins in the quantity that they can put on the site. Now, that being said, they're also trying to sell it on the bling. So whenever you go into a new off-the-plan development, you'll always have what they call a display concept, and you can walk into, sometimes it's portable, sometimes it's a corner, they've bought a building around the corner and they've set up a mock-up showroom of the actual property. Now, when you walk into there, you're seeing modern appliances, you're seeing the aesthetics that they're trying to achieve in terms of trying to build it out. And you get excited about seeing all these new and fresh and clean lines and, you know, 2-pack benching and stone bench types, stainless steel appliances, blah, blah, blah. And that's what they're trying to sell you on. You've obviously usually got a little model, and then you're picking, you know, there's normally a lot of red dots showing the properties that have been secured for $1,000, saying that, you know, 30% of this site is already pre-sold, blah, blah. So when they're pricing these assets, what they do is they price these assets usually at the established benchmark or even higher. Now, what I mean by established benchmark is they are pushing the boundaries on the price point for that type of property in that area compared to the existing stock in the market. An example, these one-bedroom apartments might have been selling for $420,000, whereas if we had have shopped around the corner and found a one-bedder in a smaller complex, that may be worth around $340,000. And they're arguing, well, that's a 1970s complex, it's ugly, this is new, modern, and so they're trying to push that premium. So for me, the message I've got there is these types of assets take time to be absorbed as a price point. So once they're actually finished and complete, they do set the median price for units in the area, and so the market looks genius in terms of anyone says, oh, guess what, Brunswick's done really well. It's really just these apartments hitting the register. So they're pushing the median value up, but in reality, the median hasn't moved much at all. So what then happens is what's going to then drive the value of those properties forward? So what's going to give them that resale value? The argument to that is not much. You know, they've set that new benchmark. So, and the classic case, if one of them sold or two or three of them are sold through a forced sale or a downturn in the marketplace or whatever reason, there's been a fire sale, all of a sudden, all of the others are now priced at that point, because we can usually find with larger accommodation historical sales. We only need to go on a domain or realestate.com and find that. And the value is looking at that as well. So it stagnates in its growth point.
Yeah, look, I think there's 3 filters that you should apply to the property. So once you've actually done the hard work and identified the investment grade suburb, which is not easy, but once you've identified the investment grade suburb, you've still got to put filters overlaying the investment grade property. Now, I think that the 3 basic ones are investment grade, scarcity, and owner-occupier appeal. So
everyone get that? That's a bit of gold. Say that again, Bryce.
So those 3 are scarcity, investment grade, owner-occupier appeal. But in your question, Aaron, you talk about the fact that the development contains 130 properties. So in my view, that's well away from what I would consider scarcity. So I actually prefer to buy the properties that are near these developments, that are built in the 70s, that have got size over shine. And by that, I mean, back in 70s, you maybe only had 12 in the block or 15 in the block. They built them a little bit bigger. They might have original kitchens, original bathrooms at the moment, versus these new ones that probably don't have the same sort of floor plan, but they're a bit shinier. And they often get the old-fashioned depreciation sizzle that comes from it. But ultimately, to give you another example outside of Melbourne, I recently bought a property for a client in Hamilton in Brisbane. I paid $355,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. And if I had looked at the stats, it said that Hamilton was heavily oversupplied and had a huge vacancy issue. But if you lift the bonnet a little bit, you'd see down near Brett's Wharf and down near the water in Hamilton, you've got all these high-rise, brand new apartments that are selling for $450,000 to $550,000, achieving a much higher rental, which was causing the oversupply in the area. But the fact remains that I bought this property for the client within walking distance of Racecourse Road that had all the lifestyle drivers that really drive that particular area. We weren't even close to being in the same league as what those other properties were doing. And we'll actually piggyback off them, Ben. They're going to bring wine bars, sushi bars, cafes.
Critical mass of population, which gives us everything that drives an area.
All the stuff that we like. We'll let them do the heavy lifting in terms of bringing the people there, and we'll just get sucked along for the ride. So I think the number one issue with this property that you've highlighted, Aaron, and probably, I'll actually quickly go to your last part of the question. You said, your podcast has been saying location first, property next, but I'm confused by this property. Well, hopefully that can dispel a little bit of confusion, because in our view, it doesn't pass the scarcity test.
That's right. And if I could pick up another bit of gold that Bryce talked about there, shine over size. So let's not confuse or misinterpret the fact that we think that the actual internal area, so in other words, the internal square metres of the block, is the size component. So we're not saying that the 60s and 70s or the Art Deco apartments are greater in size at all. What we're talking about is size of land. So the land to asset ratio. So the land to asset ratio is reflective of, we have 1 in 8. So we've got 1/8 of that land size that we're owning, which is the blue. At the end of the day, it's the land value of the area that underpins our value of our property or dwelling that sits on top of that. So, we control 1/8 of that, as opposed to 1/30th of, in this particular case that Aaron mentioned. So again, don't think that shine over size is to say that the older apartments are smaller in size. They're not. We're comparing apples with apples. So we're saying, if the apartment size is 68 square metres or 75 square metres, what we're basically talking about there is an older style versus a newer style. Now, the fact is that both the bedrooms are usually going to be of similar size. If you've got 75 square metres or higher, you usually have 2 double bedrooms. So in other words, it's not a shoebox for the second bedroom. And at 75 square metres internal, you've usually got a dining table and also a living area. So enough space outside of the kitchenette area to actually have a dining table and then the living zone. So for us, we still love the bigger sized apartments, but if you want to compare apples with apples, we're still saying that, this apartment might have sold for 420 versus 320,000. It's that difference that we're leveraging from. So what you were saying before, over time, the property that's going to have the outperformed capital growth result from a percentage point of view is going to be the old, because they're going to be dragged up to that new price point. It's not to say that these things will collapse in value, because it's a medium density. The high rise, high density and large conglomerates of apartments being built in one area, they have the ability to collapse usually. But in these types of examples where it's still a big development, but it's in Brunswick, has a lot of freestanding and residential homes, we normally don't see a collapse. We just don't see performance in growth.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think if you think about this too, Aaron, in terms of when it's a long weekend in Australia, the first thing that Australians tend to do is they want to jump in the car and they want to drive out to the country and see, some countryside and some nature, whether it's ocean, whether it's the mountain, whether it's the bush. And whilst our culture in Australia is changing, I think that's intrinsically been who we are. And I say that because we're not a Manhattanization city or a high density Asian city. People still value privacy. They still value their own space. They don't want to be in a fishbowl. So again, the location being right, it's got that awesome proximity to the city. But I think the actual real estate is fundamentally counterintuitive to what the majority of Australian culture wants. Now, I say that knowing that will change as our country becomes more multicultural and you get more Asian style cities and you get more European style cities where density is the norm. But typically in Australia, people still value their own privacy and their own space. I recently had a client who moved from Adelaide, wanted to move into Melbourne. We looked at some really great properties in the fringes of Melbourne, and their number one deal breaker was, I don't want to be in a fishbowl. So I think hopefully that's helped you, because if we go to the if I go back to your final part of the paragraph again, it says, but I'm confused. Why is this place so cheap? Is if it's because it's the property itself, does it mean the location is not always the biggest factor? And finally, should investors seriously consider properties like this or stay clear? I'll get Ben to answer that last bit. But if we just rewind to what Ben said, and I think it can be easily glossed over, but it's a really poignant point, that if you're buying in one of 8 properties in a development, and it could be a 70-style development, a reasonably significant chunk of the purchase price is relating to the land content. Versus if you're buying 1 out of 130, a very large percentage of your purchase price is going towards the bricks and mortar or the construction, the steel, versus a very small component going towards the land. And that's a really significant thing in this case. And it's a significant reason, in my view, why the performance has been poor.
And I'll jump in on what Bryce was saying there around the whole idea of acceptance of density. Sydney has a greater acceptance of density than what Melbourne does, and then obviously Melbourne, then Brisbane, then Perth, etc. Now, when you get into Adelaide, there's very little acceptance of density at all. So again, it's about that local market mindset that Bryce is talking about. Now, fast forward to 2028, and we're going to have potentially another 5 million people living in our cities. So that acceptance of density will change. But it still doesn't reduce the scarcity element of those other assets. So, I don't want to live in a hotel room. And that's what fishbowl you use. I have the analogy of just doors lined up in a hallway. And if I want to go on stay in a hotel for an anniversary or whatever, I like that feeling. But I don't necessarily want to feel like I'm constantly travelling, living in a. But there are absolutely, our Asian friends and Indian friends, they've grown up that way. Yeah. So they've got a complete acceptance to that model. And that's why we're seeing a lot of the foreign investments going into that higher density stuff. Whereas the current Australian mindset and psyche is that we still want that privacy component.
Agreed. The other point is if we go back to the 3 filters too, Aaron, and for the benefit of the listeners, investment grade, scarcity, we've covered scarcity. Owner-Occupier Appeal, I think in a block of 130, now I don't know the actual answer to this one, but I would be strongly guessing that a large percentage of the people who are living there would be tenants versus owner-occupiers. So again...
Does he mention in there, Bryce, about getting a fairly good yield?
I'd have to have a quick look through, but...
The reason why I say that is because usually on these Lego land type sites, the actual yields are pretty good because they really have been built for tenants. They haven't been built with an owner-occupier appeal. So, Aaron, I will challenge you on your view, having looked at the site, and I promised you when I spoke to you on the phone that I'd look at the site. To me, it doesn't have owner-occupier appeal.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. It looks a little bit same, but here's one of the things. We travel around the country, Ben. We talk, at a number of talks that we get to do. One of the things I always say is if you're a buy and hold strategy versus a buy and sell strategy, the number one person that you've got to impress is not the property manager, it's not the tenant, it's not your accountant, it's not yourself, it's not your wife. The number one person that you have to impress as a property investor is the valuer. Now, if the valuer comes and looks at a property that's got 130 in it, they know that there could be fire sales, they know that there could be people hemorrhaging, they know that there could be interstate investors, and they will put a risk rating on that valuation based on all of these things. Versus if they've got one around the corner that's 3 streets away that, as you say, is 2 train stops further away from the city, they'd place a less risk rating on that property, given the fact that it has a higher owner-occupier appeal, and if it goes to auction, someone might be prepared to pay an emotional price for that asset. But I can't see an emotional price being paid for this asset, because if you miss one, you're just happy to go for the other 129.
Yeah, I refer to that as mainstream appeal. I've often used analogies around top 40 music. If there was a perfect formula for it, everyone would be writing the same music with the same beat tones and the same. So we don't know what it is, but there's a little chemistry or a little formula that happens. So when we all hear it, we love the song and it sells well. And that creates that demand component. Whereas if we hear alternative music or something that's got something that's screaming in my ear, we don't like that. So we don't like that alternative aspect. Now, I'm not saying that this block has really strong alternative aspects, but it doesn't show me character. It doesn't show me timeless status. It doesn't show me all the things that I'm looking for that will last the test of time. It may be modern and contemporary today, but will it date? Which is, I'm sure when the 70s came out and everyone saw those brick veneer properties, they're going, wow, this is a beautiful, but obviously time has marked its moment on those particular properties. So from my point of view, there's not that owner-occupier, that lifestyle appeal that I'm looking for, where when the for sale sign goes up the front, there's people queuing up to look at it.
So we've been pretty consistent in our views, in everything we write, in the blogs that we write, in the discussions we have with clients, in videos that we shoot, that we would prefer established properties over new. So new really suits typically a first homeowner market, if that's all they can do to get into the marketplace and get some of the incentives and the grants and the stamp duty concessions. It also suits people who are non-residents, and that's all that they can buy. But if you aren't either of those two groups of people, in our view, if you're investing, you're better served by not buying brand new. And I'll just give you a quick example. When I was doing some research, Ben and I had identified a suburb in Brisbane, New Farm. Some of you may know that pretty well. I quickly did some analysis within a 6-month period of properties that were on a main road, on a side road, and brand new. And it was very, very clear. Brunswick Street in New Farm, there's Metha Road in New Farm, there's James Street in New Farm. And the ones that were on the main roads underperformed by a couple of percent compound as compared to the side streets. But interestingly, some of the better, so Moray Road in New Farm, there were some new developments that had actually only done 2.38% compound growth over a period of time. So that's giving some of the sales commissions. It's taking a little while for it to grow to give some of the sales commissions back, but it was very, very clear, and it reinforced on the ground the things that we're talking about. Established on non-busy roads, smaller blocks are performing better than some of these big gargantuans.
That's right. And if I can sort of, I suppose, in my capacity as the chair of PIPA, what's really important about that message, we've got trained eyes. We've been doing this for 15 to 20 years, and so are most professionals who are qualified to do this type of stuff. So that's why you pay a buyer's agent. That's why you go out and say, I'm going to pay this person, 2% or $10,000, $15,000, whatever. Because if they go and buy a lemon and that has 2% price growth, and the ones that have identified by the buyer's agent, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars in value difference over a 20 or 30 year period. So that's money in the bank. So the reality is, from that point of view, is this is not, it's a real science, and it's an art form that you can't just sit on an internet and research an area without sort of understanding that. I mean, like surgeons, like anyone, there's no substitute for experience.
It's the biggest asset class in this country, bar none, and it's the only investment market in the world not dominated by investors. But unfortunately, that gives people the false sense of security that they can.
Well, everyone thinks they know it, don't they? Because they live in it.
Exactly.
That's a conversation for another podcast.
20 minutes has flown, Ben. A couple of things we want to do before we go. One is to thank Aaron for that really great question. We hope that's been beneficial to everyone. It's really sort of real life investing 101. They're actually trying to apply the principles that we're talking about on the ground. Last week, Ben talked to you about some research that he'd done with respect to the Sydney boom of 2001 to 2003, and then analysing what happened post the boom in 2004 and 2007, because he's been on record in numerous media outlets over the last 3 to 6 months talking about how he thinks that Sydney might give some back. Now, we've put some research up on our website. In fact, Ivis, who helps us out with the Property Couch, has given us a resources section on the website. So you can go and get all these free resources from there that we're talking about. But Ben, I know we're over 20, but I think this is really important if our listeners can just forgive us for a few extra minutes this week, because I think there's some really key insights that you want to share.
Yeah, look, I mean, go onto the website, download. I've done a 15-minute presentation that's a bonus to our usual podcast. But I just wanted to wrap up some data across the total market. So from February 2001 to December 2003, we saw a very large increase in median values across the Sydney market. So there's 519 suburbs with houses, and every one of those suburbs during the boom period increased in value. But during the correction phase, not the burst of the bubble, but the correction phase, I refer to as the balloon, the letting out of the air, 342 of those suburbs, or 66% of the marketplace, gave back some of those gains.
Two out of every three gave it back.
2 out of every 3 gave it back. So, and then I looked at the unit market, and there was 295 suburbs that had enough sample data to warrant a statistical reference. That had a boom period. 4 suburbs that had unit didn't grow in value during the boom phase. But of those 295 that grew in value, 183, or again, ironically, 2 out of 3 suburbs gave back some of that gain. So my message about the Sydney market at the moment is, prices could still continue to keep going up for the remainder of this year, but you could be in a situation where you give up some of those gains. So to think that your fear of missing out, you shouldn't be panicking like that. You potentially should keep your powder dry or be, as we've always said, a boardless investor and get into some other markets where you're timing the market better.
Yeah, so Ben talked about bubble versus balloon last week. So if you missed that, go and check out episode 14. And then he was invited to go on to ABC News 24 on Saturday morning at 8:15. So for those of you that slept in, that didn't catch that, we're actually going to put that interview up on the Property Couch as well, because I think there's some really good stuff that Ben's covered off that. And I mean, the host asked him some really topical and poignant questions that I think everyone's asking, and Ben nailed it in his responses. So we're going to put that up for you as well at the Property Couch, so you can go and check that out. And the last cross-reference before we sign off is episode 7 of the podcast. We talked about is studio or one-bedroom apartments, do they make for a great investment property? So if you haven't heard that particular episode and you're listening to today's episode, that'll be a really great cross-reference for you. So as per usual, if you like what we're doing, if you could tell your friends, other property investors all about us, send them to the Property Couch, send them to iTunes, send them to the Android store so they can subscribe to our podcast, because we're really enjoying giving you the insider's guide to property investing. And of course, we often send you notification that there's a new episode via our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can follow us at the Property Couch. So it's been a good, very, very good podcast this week. I think it's been really relevant, and hopefully you got something out of it too, Ben.
I did. Absolutely love this stuff. So see you next week. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. See you, folks.